Okay, this is part 2 for the class of March 25th in Water and Natural Resources Law. So where I left off was Congress in 1975 concluded that it was time to provide more direction to the Forest Service in the management of multiple uses for sustained yield. So take yourself back to 1975. In your imagination, or for at least one of us, in fact, and just imagine the Congress of that time. So a Republican majority enacted or passed the Clean Water Act and then overrode the veto of President Nixon. So a Republican majority enacted that statute in 1972 or so. President Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency by executive order in order to consolidate water quality and air quality and hazardous waste under one roof, the alternative being a far less effective, more fragmented regulation under multiple roofs. In that same time, Congress enacted the Clean Air Act that interrupted the race to the bottom. Like the Clean Water Act, interrupted that race to the bottom, the competition between states who could regulate industry least. Again, bipartisan support for the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. Think about the great statutes that govern natural resources, and most of them relate in one way or the other back to the late 60s, early 1970s, when the National Forest Management Act was enacted. So this act requires each national forest to prepare a land and resource management plan, LRMP, which in common English and plain English is always called a forest plan. So each national forest must have a forest plan, and each forest plan must include what are called standards and guidelines. Now, for simplicity, I'll just call them standards. But there are standards, guidelines, objectives. There are various categories, with standards being the dominant. The standards really are a description of the desired future conditions for a given beneficial use, like range or timber or recreation. And the standards are also stated in the negative, in other words, to prohibit certain degradation of beneficial use. So forest plan must be adopted periodically by a national forest. The adoption itself is subject to the National Environmental Policy Act, in that it's a discretionary federal action which will have effects on subsequent activities. And each forest plan must include these standards, as well as procedures for implementation. In theory, the plans should be amended every 15 years. In theory, meaning that's what the statute says. In practice, it almost never happens, and that's simply because the national forests don't have the budget sufficient to actually complete the planning process on time in light of all their other priorities. It's not an easy process. You got to go through NEPA. You got to consider public comment. There's political pressure. It is commonplace to have senators and representatives or governors lobby the chief or the forest supervisor. So when you add inadequate budget with competing priorities, with public comment in NEPA, with political pressure, you understand why these plans are, in fact, not amended every 15 years. Maybe every 20 to 30 years might be a better approximation of reality. When they are amended, the National Forest is required to assemble an interdisciplinary team of scientists. So a soil scientist, a hydrologist, a fish biologist, wildlife biologist, an economist with respect to the impacts of the standards or the proposed standards on the local economy, and so forth. Ultimately, a forest plan is a policy call that reflects the forest supervisor's uh, uh, effort to best balance the multiple uses. Once that plan is in effect, it then governs all subsequent activities, discretionary activities, and specifically timber sales, which are the focus of our discussion tonight. So a proposed timber sale in any national forest is subject to various transactional requirements that we will discuss momentarily. It's also subject to compliance with the substantive standards of the applicable forest plan. Um, okay, so I doubt that any of you have ever seen a forest plan, and I hope you're grateful that I didn't assign to you responsibility to read one. Let's just say they're written in very dry English. If you decide to practice timber law, you actually have to have them in your office at this point. They are now being put online. Previously, up until 5 years ago, you had to have paper copies of them. Typical forest plan is probably about that big. If you include the NEPA document, we're talking that big. Why do you have to know it? Because it states the standards that apply to a timber sale, and for that matter, other discretionary permits for development. Think of a forest plan as a zoning ordinance. That's really what it is. There are certain standards that apply to an entire national forest, but generally speaking, a national forest includes a varied topography, or at least that's true in the western United States. And that varied topography will then have specific standards that apply to this region, but not that one, or excuse me, this area, but not that one. And so there are general standards, and then there are area-specific standards, and you have to figure out which standard applies to a particular activity. Obviously, the general standards all apply to any activity, but then which area are you in? Which leads us to the article that I had you read by Martin Nye and Emily Shimbra, The Important Role of Standards in National Forest Planning Law and Management. I've covered much of this in terms of the why and the how, I suppose, in the course of this lecture so far. But I'd like for you to focus on what they call typology of forest planning standards, beginning on page 44 ELR 10285. So there are mandatory and discretionary standards. I mean, that's true in virtually any law. It's true in the standards which implement the rules which implement the National Forest Management Act. Some say specifically, thou shalt not. Others say, in effect, use your judgment and leave discretion. So somewhere between thou shalt not and thou may, most standards, every standard will fall. As I said before, some are forest-wide, others are management area specific, which is to say that the National Forest has a map that divides up the entire forest into management area 1, 2, 3, and 4. Actually, they're given names, but for the sake of simplicity, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the standards are then specific to the areas. Simple and complex, again, that should be bread and butter to you by now. Even though language is best when simple, that doesn't mean that law is simple. Often law is quite complex, and that's true for standards too. Although I will say, I have never seen a standard in a forest plan that exceeds, say, 2 paragraphs in length. So complex doesn't mean 50 pages. You'll never see a standard like that. It might be a line, it might be a paragraph, it might be a couple paragraphs. Simple versus complex simply means the substance of it and not the length. Prioritization standards, you see this on page 10286. In other words, the standard may say X, Y, and Z are legal in Area 1 with preference to X. So in plain English, what could that mean? Let's just say that Area 1 is the best fish and wildlife habitat in the national forest, for the sake of discussion. Then a prioritization standard will say, in the event of a trade-off or a potential conflict between timber and fish and wildlife prevails in Area 1, whereas in Area 2, ... Threshold-based standards. We actually see several of these in the one of our cases tonight. A threshold, in a familiar context, is dissolved oxygen in water. If you know anything about fish, you know that they get their oxygen from the water. They need a certain amount in order to survive. So a threshold is water will never have less than X parts per million of oxygen as a result of activities within the Forest Service's control. That's a threshold standard. You actually see such a standard for dissolved oxygen in many of the forest plans in California. Then other standards are process-based. In effect, they're procedures in the form of standards. And then management method, in effect requiring a particular management method like selective harvest versus clear cutting with respect to timber use. You see in this same article a concern that standards tend to be written very differently across time, across national forests, and across regions. All I can say is that's true of every administrative agency. No, the Forest Service does not have its own blue book, but it does have a style manual in the form of the Forest Service Handbook that I previously mentioned. And generally speaking, I think the Forest Service is trying to move in the direction of more standardization, at least of the form of standards, because obviously different forms over time tend to create difficulty. If one standard is stated very completely and another standard begs every possible question and leaves a lot to inference, then what's a court going to do in a case which involves both standards? How do you determine what the Forest Service's intent is? It's easier for a court reviewing a particular action if the standards are written in a uniform manner. That makes it more easier for the court to then administer the standards. But ultimately, I mean, this is an administrative agency. It's not, nothing will ever be done in a completely standard way. And what really matters, I think, where the Forest Service is trying to improve most, is just clarity as to what the intent is, because, of course, that's what the court cares about most. What's the intent of the agency in administering these statutes? On page 10295, you see adaptive management. Adaptive management is a term widely used in the management of natural resources today. If you talk with any practitioner, they will roll their eyes about it because it pretty much describes any response after the moment a given approval goes into effect. It's, I mean, the term for any response now is adaptive management. What the professors are talking about here, and what the Forest Service at least endeavors to do, is something much more disciplined than trial and error response to changed circumstances. Adaptive management in its classic form means that there is a hypothesis. If X, then Y. If timber operation is permitted in Area 2 but not Area 1, then the fish and wildlife population of this national forest will, in 20 years, be the same as today. I mean, that's a testable hypothesis using the scenario that I've used for illustration so far. Adaptive management then means that if the fish and wildlife population declines in Area 1, maybe it's because Area 1's downslope from Area 2. Maybe it's because there's more sedimentation coming from Area 2 that is contributing to a loss of fish and wildlife habitat. Or maybe Area 1 is upslope of Area 2 and there's no connection whatsoever between the timber operation and the fish and wildlife conditions in Area 1. In any event, adaptive management is, in its classic form, a testable hypothesis with specific monitoring methods and an analysis of results so that management is adapted in response to changing conditions over the term of a given plan. So over the 15 to 30 year practical term of a forest plan, adaptive management could be included in a standard that permits the standard to vary somewhat based on the circumstances that are monitored over time. As a general matter, standards are not enforceable in a freestanding form. That is consistent with the constitutional requirement that a court does not hear an abstract controversy. It does not opine on a legal issue just for the sake of opining. It instead has jurisdiction only over a case. And while there is case law that is inconsistent here, the general tendency is that the standards in forest plans are reviewable in the context of how they are applied in discretionary approvals such as timber sales. Okay, so let me turn now to timber sales. I gave you Forest Service Manual, Chapter 2430, or more specifically, just the table of contents for it. In order for you to get a sense of how a timber sale works on a national forest, the details, namely the actual text behind all this, is more than you need to know. I want you to understand the basic structure of this regulatory program. So turn to page 6 of 105, and specifically Chapter 2431, Management of the Timber Sale Program. You will see the regional forester has a responsibility. What's that? Well, you can't see the text, so I'll just tell you. The regional forester basically has a responsibility to manage the timber sales across his or her region in a manner that advances the regional interest, as recognized by the several statutes that we've now discussed. In other words, a given national forest may produce far less timber than another one. It's the regional forester's job to make sure that the forest plans, and specifically the timber sales across the several national forests, add up to a coherent regional program. Forest supervisor then follows whatever instruction is given by the regional forester with respect to timber sales within his or her national forest, and the district ranger is then responsible for an even more granular level of implementation of the regional priorities. Timber sales are not initiated by timber operators. They're initiated by the regional forest or by the forest supervisor on behalf of a national forest. There is a schedule for them. You see that in 2431.2. There are rates, meaning a rate per 1,000 board feet, or there may be a different metric, but that's a common metric. Why? Because the Forest Service incurs cost to administer a timber sales program, and in effect royalties are being paid through the timber sale leases in order to recover those costs. So pre-sale preparation, this is page chapter 2432. And I see I'm 9 seconds away from my 20 minutes. I'm going to stop this and we'll go to part 3.